In 1971, the full-sizers from Oldsmobile were all new, and that included the Olds Delta 88, as well as the 98 and the Tornado. It would be one more year before the intermediates would be revised, but the lineup for Olds in 1971 was an attractive one. And if you take a look at the interiors for 1971, well, they weren't that bad, but they also were starting to display some of the cost-cutting that General Motors was exhibiting during this time frame. I don't think, as an example, that anyone would confuse the luxury of a 1971 Oldsmobile 98 interior versus, let's say, one from the mid-60s that just had more upscale materials as well as quality feel to the switchgear, the door handles, and kind of everything that you touched. But in any case, there were a number of interesting things that were introduced for 1971 on the Oldsmobiles in that year. The first was that the engines were somewhat revised. In particular, they had to run on no-lead regular fuel, and that was a mandate across General Motors' entire lineup from the president's office, President Ed Cole. And so even Corvettes had to have engines that ran on regular no-lead fuel. This was really in anticipation of EPA regulations that were fast developing. Oldsmobile also introduced a very sophisticated so-called G-Ride system in 1971 where the cars had computer-selected springs that were exactly matched to the option content of the car. This was a pretty smart idea because if you had a car with air conditioning as an example versus not, or the 455 versus not, you're going to have different weight in the car, and in order to have the car handle at its best level, you need to have the right overall suspension setup that was designed for that. Now, those are, let's say, more conventional style options and content changes, but there was a somewhat strange feature that was optional on Oldsmobiles in 1971 that few people know about, and it was a one-year only option, and that is the gear shift lever wiper cycle control. Take a look here at the 1971 Oldsmobile brochure, and you can see that it says that you can get this piece of optional equipment that allows you to basically have the wipers sweep the windshield with one pass if you depress a button at the end of the gear shift lever. Now, why Oldsmobile would put this button at the end of the gear shift lever and make it optional content, well, I'm not quite sure. Although it was pretty typical during this time frame for cars not to have the so-called mist feature or one-pass feature where you'd depress a button and the wipers would make one swipe. You really had to turn them on and then off again on many of the wiper setups of the day. So this feature was made optional, and it was made optional and was only for 1 year on Oldsmobiles. And you can see here, here's a typical Olds interior of the time with the standard gear shift. The shifter looks normal. It has this black rubber end piece to it. Nothing really to write home about. But now take a look at the gear shift lever when you got the optional wiper control system. And you can see there's a little button at the end of the gear shift lever, and it looks different. It's got a kind of more, let's say, metallic look to it. So how would this work? You would be driving along, you'd have the car in drive, and you want the wipers to basically make one pass. You just push that button at the end of the gear shift lever, and that would activate the wipers for the one pass feature. Now, the wiper control for these full-size Oldsmobiles was on the driver's side, on the left-hand side of the instrument panel, and you can see it just had a off, low, and a high setting. Now, why was this feature made a one-year only feature? I think that it perhaps was expensive to put it at the end of the gear shift and was also a bit awkward. It's not quite intuitive why you would put it at the end of the gear shift. My guess is because it didn't require much movement of your hands from the steering wheel. You could just probably even have the car in drive and just reach over with one of your fingers very easily, not taking your complete hand off the steering wheel, push the button, and then you have the wipers wipe that one cycle. Now, what is also interesting about this is in the next model year, 1972, Oldsmobile made standard the mist feature on its wiper control. So now that control that previously just had off, low, and high had a position underneath the off position where it was spring-loaded. You could push down on it, and when you push down on it, it would execute the one-pass feature, and it was labeled mist. That was what they called it. So you didn't have to turn the wipers on again and then off to have this one pass feature. You could just depress the control downward to have the one pass mist feature. So that, I guess, obviated the need for having the button at the end of the gear shift lever, and was probably cheaper just to incorporate it into the control. And like I said, it was made standard as opposed to optional equipment. So I suppose Olds potentially lost some revenue, but they delighted more customers. It's hard to believe, now in this day and age where most cars have interval wipers, some have rain sensing interval wipers, and all of them have the mist feature, that didn't even exist back in the day. But like I said, more often than not, you just had to turn the wipers on again, then off again to activate them for one pass. And that was viewed as acceptable by and large. Now, strangely, this wouldn't be the only time that General Motors would try to use the gear shift for option content. I don't know what the infatuation was with the gear shift lever and putting optional content on it, but that was something that General Motors had for a number of years. Can anybody else recall another instance where GM put optional content on the end of the gear shift? I'll give you a few seconds for suspense. If you said the 1980 Chevrolet Citation, you would be correct. Now, can you guess what feature was on the end of the gear shift? In that case, it was not the wipers. It was the cruise control. So in order to activate the cruise control on the 1980 Citation, you would depress the end of the gear shift lever to set the cruise. Again, I think the thought was you really didn't have to move your hand very far. Didn't even have to take it off the steering wheel. You could push the button, you could activate the cruise, and you could be on your merry way. But again, that was another short-lived feature, as was the vertical radio in those Citations that emulated the radios in the 1963 Corvette, for instance. But yeah, GM just had an obsession, I guess, with putting content on the end of gear shift levers. And I think that began with the 1971 Oldsmobile. I can't think of any other GM vehicle or other vehicle before that put content at the end of the automatic transmission gear shift. If I'm forgetting one, put a comment in the comments section and you can help me remember. Now, regardless, the 1971 Oldsmobiles, the full-sizers, I would say in general, are quite good cars. They're handsome lookers, and they have durable engines and transmissions. Generally, the Olds 350 or the 455 cubic inch V8s made it to turbo hydromatic transmissions that were ultra smooth and reliable. The only thing about these 71 Oldsmobiles, the full sizes, is that their body structure is relatively jiggly compared to the previous generation cars. And I call it the GM jiggle. And you notice it, and the door closures aren't as robust. The doors tend to sag, whether they're 4 doors or 2 doors, after not that long of a time frame. And the quality, in terms of the assembly quality, wasn't necessarily all that great. The gaps don't always line up. The interior materials aren't quite as good. And like I said, the engines had been tuned to run on regular unleaded fuel, which meant that they had lower compression ratios and lower horsepower ratings than the 1970 versions. So these were kind of a step backward in some ways, but they're still nice cars and comfortable drivers, and I will say they are quiet, especially at freeway speeds. GM did a great job with the sound insulation and with the glass ceiling on these compared to even the previous versions, and really started to get rid of all those little elements that could create wind turbulence and eddy currents around the car, so that when you were driving at 70, 75 miles per hour, you really didn't hear anything but silence and just a very faint amount of road noise that came up through the chassis. So that's one of the coolest options that I think few people know about that was a 1-year only option, is this gear shift wiper control on your 71 Oldsmobiles. Be on the lookout for it at your local car shows. Of course, there aren't many 71 Oldsmobiles roaming around anymore, so you might be looking for some time at car shows in order to find one that has this piece of content. Thanks again for watching. And if you know of any other funky option content that you'd like me to talk about, put a comment in the comment section. I will do so.